Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Rebecca Slayton. I'm an associate professor in the Science and Technology Studies Department and the director of the Judith Reppy Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies, both at Cornell University. I'm very pleased that the Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies is partnering with the Southeast Asia program to host tonight's roundtable on authoritarianism and democratic backsliding in Southeast Asia. In recent years, we've seen a resurgence of authoritarianism in nations around the world. Right here in the United States, we went from electing our first Black president in 2008 and re-electing him in 2012 to electing an authoritarian, Donald Trump, in 2016. And while a slim majority of US citizens defeated Trump at the polls in 2020, many members of his party refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of the election and even encouraged a violent challenge to the electoral process. And even after the inauguration of Joe Biden, many of these same political leaders have responded not by changing their policy positions or even their messaging, but by rather trying to roll back voting rights and thereby retain power. So authoritarianism is an issue that's close to home for everyone at Cornell, as well as to many people in other parts of the world. But it does look different in various parts of the world. In the United States, it primarily takes the form of structural violence, making it more difficult for Black and brown communities to vote, for example. In other parts of the world, authoritarianism is more likely to be expressed in terms of state-sanctioned direct violence. Of course, no state practices authoritarianism in a vacuum, and the actions of leaders in one nation are often emulated by others. More powerful states can encourage or discourage authoritarianism in less powerful states. So tonight we're going to be focusing on varieties of authoritarianism in Southeast Asia, particularly in Myanmar, Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines. We're honored to have an extremely distinguished panel of experts who can discuss each of these cases. And I'm very happy to turn things over to my colleague in the government department, Tom Poptinsky, to introduce our panel and moderate tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca, for the introduction. And it's lovely to see you all. I'm particularly glad to see that we've got so many participants today, not only from here in the US, but also from Southeast Asia as well. And we're excited and honored to bring you 4 really distinguished guests who will be able to share their thoughts about contemporary authoritarianism and democratic backsliding in Southeast Asia. So without further ado, I'll introduce the 4 panelists and then we'll turn it over to our first speaker. Our panelists today are Eve Warburton, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. She'll be speaking to us today about Indonesia. Second, we'll have on Thailand, Pawan Chachawal Pongpan, who's an associate professor in the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at Kyoto University. Following that, we'll have a presentation on on the Philippines by Mark Thompson. He's a professor of politics and head of the Department of Asian and International Studies at the City University of Hong Kong, where he is also director of the Southeast Asia Research Center. And then we'll have a presentation covering politics and contemporary developments in Burma, Myanmar. And this will be by Ardith Tong Mung, who's the chair of the Political Science Department and interim director of the Peace and Conflict Studies program at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell. So without further ado, let me turn it over to our first speaker, Eve Warburton. Eve, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Tom. And thanks very much to Cornell for the invitation. So let me just set up my screen here and let me know if everyone can see it. Can you see that? Yep, great. Okay. So I'm going to be talking about democratic decline in Indonesia. And I think most of the audience would know that for the best part of the last sort of 2 decades, Indonesia was sort of often described as a kind of democratic beacon in a very sort of politically troubled region that is Southeast Asia. But there's really a consensus now amongst analysts both within and outside of Indonesia that the last sort of 10 to 5 years, Indonesia's democracy has been sort of stagnating, and now it's in this period of serious decline. Oh, sorry, I don't know why that happened. A serious decline. So what does that decline look like? What are some of the substantive features of decline? What we've seen, there are many, many features, but I'm going to highlight 3. New attacks on the political opposition, shrinking civic space and growing state intolerance towards dissent, and the hollowing out of key democratic institutions. Let me talk about each one just briefly now. So new attacks on the political opposition. What we've seen are opposition parties and groups affiliated with opposition parties increasingly discriminated against and intimidated by the state. And this has really been a product of years of political polarization. So with each electoral cycle, basically since 2014, we've seen the deepening of polarization between the incumbent pluralist coalition on the one hand and Islamist affiliated or ideologically conservative Islamic political parties and organizations. And that polarization, that concept, that perception of the incumbent coalition, that these Islamist groups and parties constitute a serious threat to the incumbent, has motivated them to take a very hardline approach to controlling and containing Islamic groups through intimidation and through repression and a whole range of illiberal means. Now, it's true that the target of this sort of hardline approach by the incumbent coalition, by the state, the targets of that approach are often very illiberal in and of themselves. So, for example, Front Pembela Islam, Hizbut Tahrir Indonesia, these are two very sort of radical, puritanical Islamist groups now banned by the Jokowi government. But at the same time, we've also seen members of and people affiliated with mainstream political parties like PKS, which is a very the most sort of Islamist political party along the ideological spectrum in Indonesia. We've had many reports and much evidence now that people affiliated with PKS are experiencing discrimination and are systematically being excluded from positions within the bureaucracy, within universities and the like. More recently, for anyone who kind of follows the sort of gets into the weeds of Indonesian politics, you may have heard that a senior member of the executive government, someone very close to Jokowi, the head of his presidential staff unit and former head of the armed forces, Muldoko, recently tried to even take over the position of chairperson in another major opposition party. That's Partai Demokrat, the party of former President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono. And even though he wasn't successful in taking over that party, the goal was to, of course, he had his own personal ambitions to lead that party, but the goal was to weaken the political opposition in Indonesia, to prevent there from being a kind of coherent Islamist-linked opposition bloc in parliament throughout Jokowi's second term, but also really what it's about is preventing there from being a kind of strong opposition threat in 2024 in the next presidential elections. Now, beyond that focus on opposition threats, what we've also seen in Indonesia is the government, a series of government actions aimed at shrinking civic space. And we've seen a state that's become increasingly intolerant towards dissent. And this is affecting groups and individuals beyond that kind of Islamist constituency that I've been discussing. So what we've seen is the government using kind of both old regulations that have been on the books for some time in Indonesia, but they have been rarely sort of been used, and new kinds of regulations designed to kind of chill sort of open public criticism about its policies and about its interventions. I was at a civil society forum recently, a big one that kind of brought together activists from across a range of sectors, from people working in sort of environmental sector, in legal rights, human rights, gender rights, things like this, and brought together journalists as well. And it was quite remarkable to hear them share very similar stories of online intimidation, often they feel backed by the state, offline intimidation as well, journalists being leaned on to report positive stories about the Jokowi administration. And they all feel that kind of the political landscape in which they're operating and trying to do their work now is very, very different to what it was 5 or 10 years ago. And they feel much more sort of a sense of kind of the state bearing upon them and pressuring them not to engage in open public criticism of the government. And we also know from survey results recently that Indonesians in general, citizens, are starting to feel are feeling more and more scared and more anxious about talking openly about politics and about expressing their opinions publicly, political opinions publicly. And we've seen that in a series of nationally representative surveys. And finally, what we're seeing more and more over the past 5 years is the hollowing out of key democratic institutions. And of course, the major example here is the recent revisions to the KPK law. So the KPK is Indonesia's much loved, very widely respected institute, the Corruption Eradication Commission, which was always sort of seen as one of the most important products of the democratic transition at the end of the 90s, and it sort of maintained this an identity as a sort of independent, relatively independent autonomous watchdog whose job it was to monitor, investigate and prosecute corruption cases. And they did so very well. And the political elite, as a result, has always felt, immense disdain for this institute. And finally, they were able to pass this law that basically puts, one of the aspects of the law is that it puts the KPK under the auspices of a state-appointed committee that can kind of oversee it and control the sorts of investigations that it pursues. And so what we're seeing now is that one of the most important checks on executive power has now become something more of like, or will become eventually some sort of partner of the state or a tool of the state in preventing corruption rather than prosecuting corruption. I would also point to sort of changes, I guess, within the DPR, within the parliament, without any robust sort of opposition, and we can debate later on the extent to which Indonesia has ever really had a robust opposition, but with very little opposition in parliament. And I would say within Jokowi's coalition, he has a much tighter control over parties within his coalition as well. What we've seen is that critical debate about state-sponsored laws has pretty much vanished in several recent examples. So there's no there's no real kind of critical, open, public discussion about some really important laws recently. And the DPR sort of has been behaving much more like a rubber stamp. And that's what happened with the KPK law. It also happened with this really big, complicated, controversial omnibus law. It had serious consequences for labor rights and for the environment. That was all kind of rushed through very recently. And without that sort of sense of public and open debate about the consequences of this law and engagement with the public, what you had instead when that law was passed was this outpouring of protest on the streets of Indonesia, and so many people followed this, and those protests all around the country were met with systematic intimidation by the state, mass arrests, violence, and some people lost their lives. So that's sort of the content, I guess, of some, I wanted to highlight some of the content of democratic decline in recent years, but what is its nature? Well, democratic decline in Indonesia, and when we're thinking about how it looks compared to the other countries that we'll be discussing today, is kind of been slow, it's insidious, and it's been often taking place couched in sort of benevolent terms. So what we hear more and more in Indonesia are state elites, talking about the need to protect Indonesia from ideological threats, from these Islamist threats, the need to overcome political polarization, prevent discord and disorder, and ensure a form of democracy that is better suited to Indonesian culture and context. So it's kind of, legitimizing and sometimes even using the terms associated with democracy to kind of, to basically legitimize the kinds of processes and interventions and changes that I've been discussing. It also involves a really diverse set of actors. And here I think Indonesia sort of stands out in comparison to, say, a country like Thailand or indeed the Philippines, where you have, or places, further away like Turkey or Brazil, where you have democratic decline or this authoritarian kind of reversals or threats are concentrated in a particular party or in a particular individual, like Duterte, say, in the Philippines. Indonesia, it's hard to point to one party or one institution or one individual even that's kind of behind this process. So it's really a whole range of actors, from the bureaucracy to political parties to the business elite, kind of seem to be coalescing around, and they seem to be sharing a whole range of, they have different interests, but they all seem to have an interest in creating a less democratic political landscape in Indonesia. And as a result of that, and I'm referring, and I'm sure Mark will talk about this, some of Mark Thompson's recent work on regression and resistance in Southeast Asia. And Indonesia sort of fits with his argument, which I hope I don't butcher your argument here, Mark, where basically the nature of a regression affects the nature of resistance, of democratic resistance. And I think in Indonesia, where you have the kind of this slow moving decline, where you have, it's kind of done in sort of piecemeal fashion and by a diverse set of actors, it's really hard to form a coherent, strong pro-democracy bloc. And that's what we don't have in Indonesia. We don't have one in parliament. We don't have a particular party that can kind of act to resist the processes that I've been describing. Nor do we have a kind of critical mass of civil society organizations and students that can kind of stand up and oppose these trends. Yes, we did have, an upsurge in student activism in 2019 and 2020, and civil society activism against these laws that I've cited. But that was quickly controlled with the combination of arrests and intimidation, and we haven't seen that kind of pro-democracy movement be sustained in the face of a kind of increasingly overbearing sort of state. What has produced this decline? I'm going to try and speak really quickly here. On the one hand, of course, Indonesia is really part of a global trend. It sort of reflects really our current political moment and trends of global democratic decline. We have a big part of the story of democratic decline in Indonesia is the rise of populist forms of political mobilization. Leaders like Prabowo Subianto, Jokowi himself, Islamist organizations have all been engaging in a kind of populist form of mobilization. And that is, like in many other countries, appealing in Indonesia because we have that same sort of sense of fatigue with established elites in Indonesia that we have elsewhere, where populists have risen to power, people who are fatigued with the status quo party system. And populism has brought with it a much more divisive brand of identity politics in Indonesia. And that's what sort of, caused a much, this deepening of political polarization that I think is at the heart of some of the processes of democratic decline that I've been describing. And we see this in other countries all around the world, of course, as well. And, just like in other countries, social media has exacerbated these sorts of forces. Zooming through. But at the same time, and very obviously, on the other hand, the forces behind this that have brought Indonesia to this moment are highly localized. There are structural weaknesses that have been built into Indonesia's democracy since the transition in the late 90s. It's a very familiar story to anyone who studies Indonesian politics that, the part of the success of the story of Indonesia's transition was that it kind of brought spoilers into the new democratic arrangement and built in weaknesses, built in people who were never fully committed to the democratic project. And so as a result, there's just a whole range of weaknesses within Indonesia's democratic institutions that are only now being tested, and in some senses failing that test. I don't think we talk enough about the rise of PDIP as a kind of part of the story of Indonesia's recent democratic decline and that kind of shrinking of civic space and the attacks on the Islamist opposition. PDIP is Indonesia's most pluralist party, and it was out of government during the Yudhoyono years, during that decade. And I think that the party, led by Megawati Soekarno Putri, the daughter of Indonesia's first president, and her family, and the core of the PDIP, have a sense of entitlement to government, and that now that they are the center of that powerful coalition, there's a determination to maintain that powerful place in government, and I don't think we should underestimate that. And then, of course, Jokowi himself. How do we kind of assess the role of Jokowi, Indonesia's president, in enabling this decline? This is a president who didn't come to power, of course, with an agenda to dismantle Indonesia's democracy. His opponent did, Prabowo, but Jokowi didn't. But there are certain features of his leadership that I think are really critical and that have helped enable these processes of decline. He's a narrow developmentalist. He has a very narrow agenda for Indonesia. We know this now. It's all about investment, infrastructure, and building a new capital, and everything else is negotiable. He has no kind of strong commitment to any real democratic institutions or principles. So he makes sacrifices, he makes deals, and his goal, whatever he needs to do to enable an orderly or to ensure an orderly and stable political environment that's conducive to his developmental goals. I kind of grappled with who Jokowi was a few years ago and what kind of Democrat he was, but we don't need to grapple with that anymore. He said it very explicitly that he's not interested in human rights, democratic institutions, freedoms, and the like. What he's interested in is development, and that's what he's here to produce. In some ways, he kind of is a bit of a techno-populist, to borrow the term from Christopher Bickerton. He sees himself as channeling the real public, the public desire, and that he understands the public and what they want, and what they want is development and economic stability, and nothing else really matters. And that's sort of who Jokowi is, and I think that's an important part of the story of Indonesia's democratic decline. Finally, I was asked to talk about implications for the medium term. I think there are two scenarios in Indonesia. The first is probably the more likely, but I wouldn't say a few years ago, I would never say the second scenario was likely, but I think now it probably is. So the one is just, regression continues at this slow pace. Indonesia maintains this kind of status as a kind of illiberal, low quality democracy. Elections continue, but the institutions that enable true representation, competition, participation, freedoms, rights, those institutions get hollowed out and are less effective, essentially. The more dramatic, scenario is that regression accelerates in the coming years, that the incumbent coalition decides that the Islamists do indeed pose a serious threat in 2024, the next presidential election. And as a result, they change the electoral rules. We now hear a lot of talk, no action yet, but talk about rolling back direct elections, potentially even direct elections for president, and returning that responsibility to the parliament. Presidential terms or even extension of presidential terms are now a thing potentially. So electoral rules may change, opposition may be a thing of the past, and the pluralist coalition in power now could form some kind of authoritarian cartel. Much more dramatic, but I wouldn't put it, I wouldn't discount that now. So that's the story of Indonesia's democratic decline, less dramatic, less violent than we've seen in places like Thailand and Myanmar. But really, I think that the end goal or the end outcome is just as concerning, but it's different at timelines, time horizons, and the nature of that decline. And thank you very much. I hope I didn't go over time.
Thank you so much, Eve. I'll make a quick announcement. Please do type in your questions that you have for our speakers, Eve or any of our other speakers, to the Q&A function that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. We'll take them at the end of all the prepared remarks, and I'll issue a couple more reminders as we go through. Next, we'll turn it over to Pawin for a discussion of current developments in Thailand.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank Cornell for the invitation to speak at this forum. It would be a challenge to talk about Thailand in 10-15 minutes, but I try my best. I want to begin with these questions. Why has authoritarianism or autocracy persisted in Thailand? And why have the Thai people been unable to eliminate it? Or in other words, what has stopped democratization process in my country? So my presentation today attempts to answer these questions. I will be talking about protests, monarchy, military, and of course, the future prospect for democracy in Thailand. I think we should begin with understanding of the Thai situation. The absolute monarchy was abolished in 1932, but the monarchy has remained fundamental to the Thai political life. And in fact, the arrival of King Bhumibol Adulyadej did change Thailand, and I have to say, not necessarily for the benefit of democracy. The late King Bhumibol was determined to restore the monarchy political hegemony by forging firm and intimate ties with the military. Together, the military and the monarchy, they have become such a forceful political engine that drove Thailand for many, many decades. And during those times, the Cold War, which erupted from the second half of the last century, did play a part in strengthening the monarchy-military alliance. We know that the United States openly supported the monarchy, and therefore a series of military regimes. This has become an exercise, that put forward in the name of containing communism back then in the Cold War. But the growing monarchy and military alliance served to entrench Thailand's autocratic political system, I would call that. And I think as a byproduct, this served to undermine the development of Thai democracy ever since. But how this autocratic system manifests itself? The palace and the military successfully crafted the monarchy, and in particular, for this case, King Bhumibol, into sort of an alternative model of democracy. And this surely obscure the fact that the monarchy, once again, in particular, King Bhumibol, was supposed to be non-political. His occasional political interventions, most evidently in 1992, if any observer of Thai politics would remember, right after the incident of Black May, when the king summoned the two opposing parties to the palace and then tried to play a role of mediator. So I would say that there was a peak of the royal hegemony, in 1992. But this kind of occasional political interventions emerged as an acceptable political norm in Thailand. So even though we realize that the king supposed to operate within the constitution, his political intervention somehow seemed to be accepted by a lot of Thai people. And both the palace and also the military successfully construed democracy as a system somewhat, tarnished by the self-interest of politicians. This has been a key theme, when this non-elective institution, trying to paint a certain picture of elected institution in the form of politician. This was so evident, in many of the king's speeches, focused on the need, to cultivate a kind of clean politics, as opposed to immoral politics characterized by rampant corruption, vote buying, and also the lack of transparency and accountability of politicians. The king's speech is something like it was a much anticipated event when Bhumibol was still alive, and he usually would give his speech during his birthday on the 5th of December. I remember growing up, watching the speeches, not knowing that there's a lot of political messages, hidden within that speech. It is almost similar to the Queen's speech, on Christmas Eve, but of course, it can also be very different in terms of what really contained within such a speech, right? The royal court reinterpreted democracy based predominantly on a sort of moral, righteous, guidance of the king. And therefore, not only did Bhumibol represent, an alternative kind of democracy known, by scholar as royal democracy. This is quite an oxymoron when you put, the two words together, one which is so not transparent with the other one, like democracy. So that's why it made the whole thing oxymoron. But this kind of reinterpretation also allowed the king to exercise his political power over politicians, and also to imprint, his legitimacy in many royal interventions over the years. Painting the king as a source of stability encouraged the royalist defender to bypass democratic mechanisms in dealing with political crisis. As a result, royal democracy served to undermine electoral politics, paving the way for the military to stage countless coups, against seemingly immoral civilians with the explicit support from the palace. However, this royal democracy leaves so little room for checks and balances. Critics of the monarchy were harshly punished by lèse majesté law. I myself also has been, charged with this draconian law as well. So I guess, if we are to discuss the prominent feature of Thai authoritarianism, it is very important to look at the combination of the existence of illiberal rule, and by illiberal rule, I mean the power of the monarchy above formal democratic system, together with the non-democratic rule, meaning the many military coups that sort of led to military government over the year. So we have this kind of two things, combined, and it's basically overshadow the entire democratization process in Thailand. The second point, apart from trying to understand the Thai situation, is then what would come next? And I would like to talk about the challenge to this kind of royal democracy. So at first, the advent of Thaksin Shinawatra in 2001 seemed to lead the way out, to the problem with the monarchy and the military. So the arrival of Thaksin was to shift the Thai political landscape. So he won the landslide election in 2001. He also accumulated political power through assertive populist policy designed to strengthen rural residents, long abandoned by the old politics dominated by the palace and the military. Thaksin's second electoral victory in 2005 finally triggered a political crisis in which, in the context of this presentation, the two political systems collided between democracy and autocracy. For the first time, the conservative concept of autocracy, placed legitimately within the royal hegemony of King Bhumibol, was seriously questioned by the popular democratic regime of Thaksin. It also became an open competition between elective and non-elective institutions, the result of which saw the eventual crumbling of the Thaksin government in the coup of 2006. But again, Thailand in 2006 was a different place. The rise of the rural populations, made possible by Thaksin's successful socio-economic policies, emerged as a persistent, disloyal opposition to the old power. And for that brief moment, the royalists and the military elite believed that they were able to uproot Thaksin's influence in politics by staging military coup. But in fact, I think they were so wrong, because the electoral victory of his sister, Yingluck, in 2001, once again, proved them wrong, right? This event, the comeback of Yingluck, right, the comeback of the Shinawatra influence, coincided with Bhumipohn's fast declining health. And eventually the king died in October 2016. Now, his son, Vajiralongkorn, was enthroned, in the aftermath of the death of his father. The problem is that his son was not loved by the public, nor by some, even among some of the political elites. Especially the political elite, they fear that Vajiralongkorn would not be able to defend the political interests that they had long invested in the monarchy. And arguably, the anxiety drove them to stage a coup against Yingluck in 2014. So we're talking about, within the first 2 decades after the millennium, Thailand encountered 2 military coups in 2006 and 2014 against, the members of the Shinawatra family. But what followed next was the installation of a new infrastructure to safeguard the autocratic system long enjoyed by the conservative elite. So what I'm saying is that they're not only this time staging a coup in order to eliminate what they perceive to be the threat to the power position of the elite, but they also come up with a new infrastructure that would further entrench this non-elective institution legitimately in politics. I think this is somewhat can be compared with what happened in Myanmar as well. We can talk about this during the Q&A to compare the 2 systems in Thailand and in Myanmar. The last point I would like to talk is coping with authoritarianism in Thailand, and in order to forecast the medium term. Following the coup against Yingluck, the military wrote a new constitution, the constitution of 2017, which is intrinsically non-democratic, right? If anything, this new constitution is so not democratic, because it gives greater power to the courts, to independent agencies, which has, in practical terms, weakened the role of elected officials and also strengthened military control over politics. Under the new charter too, the Senate is to be appointed by the junta. This sort of, backtrack, the development of democratization process in Thailand. In 1997, with that constitution, it was still perceived to be the most democratic of all time, stipulating that all the members of the Senate has to be elected. But yet again, in 2017, we travel back further from 1997. Also, in this charter, the Prime Minister does not need to be elected, paving the way for Prayut Chan-o-cha, the coup leader, to return, legitimately as Prime Minister. So, because of that, Prayut, who led the coup against Yingluck, comfortably returned to the premiership for the second time after the 2019 election. Meanwhile, the military, seemed to have found its place in a new reign of Vajiralongkorn. So the new king personally handpicked 2 consecutive army chiefs, the previous one and the current one, in order to be in this position. And this is very important. I see it as a move that would reconsolidate the traditional ties between the military and monarchy, very crucial for the staying power of these 2 institutions. Surprisingly, King Vajiralongkorn has shown ambition in politics. Previously I thought that he would show little interest, in politics, but in fact, it turned out to be the opposite. He took a large portion of power from the hand of the Privy Council so as to manage royal affairs himself. He also strove, to control certain regiments of the army, making sure that powerful members of the military would be taking his commands and also supporting his throne. He approved a pro-junta political party, the current ruling party, Palang Pracharat, to form a government after the election, as well as endorsed the second premiership of Prayut Chan-o-cha. And lastly, he also transferred all assets under the Crown Property Bureau, the state organization, which has the asset worth almost $60 billion under his possession. So in dealing with this royal opposition, Vajiralongkorn tactic proved to be ruthless, and also we can only compare this with the more subtle style of his father. What kind of ruthless tactic? Now, from relying on the judiciary to undermine the opposition, as we see in the case of the Future Vote Party, two hard-hitting tactics against critics of the monarchy. And then if we remember many cases, but one of them, when the three anti-monarchists, found to be dead, and then the body float over the Thai border, the Thai-Lao borders. So that really has threatened societies, at large, and in particular, anti-monarchist element. But the rise of autocracy, Ala Vajiralongkorn, is not without its challenges. The younger generation today is a key, among other factors that could be used to counter rising autocracy. Thai teenagers today, they have no recollection of the greatness of King Bhumibol. And because of that, they are able to sidestep state propaganda on the monarchy and its depictions as an alternative source of democracy. They also have different idea about power, legitimacy, and the concept of real democracy. Riding on the wave of social media, this younger generation has been exposed to news that would previously be inaccessible in Thailand regarding their king. For example, the photo of King Vajiralongkorn strolling in Munich, in a tiny tank top, with fake tattoos, served to erode, the previously sacred image of the Thai monarchy. And I think this has become a source of royal desacralization of King Vajiralongkorn among many Thai youth, among other reasons. So they have voiced their frustration at the royal privileges that have caused inconvenience to the public. And to me, I think little by little, Thai youth have begun to realize that autocracy must be beaten in order to bring about fairer and also more just society. So in medium term, I would say that the ongoing protests across the country, will continue. And this would become testimony of the growing voices of the Thai youth. And here we go again, the society that is divided along the monarchy lines. And unless Thailand is able to deal with autocracy, now invested so much in the current king, Vajiralongkorn, otherwise its political crisis would persist and potentially becoming very dangerous. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pawin. We've now had two excellent overviews of the state of democracy and authoritarianism in Southeast Asia. And for our next, we will hear from Professor Mark Thompson. Another reminder, I see the questions coming in through the Q&A function. Please add them as you see fit, and we'll make sure to answer as many of them as we can. Mark, over to you.
Thanks very much, Tom. I'm not muted, I'm just checking. And thanks, to Rachel, to Cornell, to CEOP for organizing this event in a time of a pandemic. Somehow we've become more global, which is a good thing, I guess. Although I miss those old, the intimacy of the old workshops. But I just want to point out that all of us Southeast Asianists scattered around the world remain grateful to an institution in upstate New York that holds the torch high. So that's much appreciated, and this is a restatement of the global interest in the topic. Although sometimes Southeast Asian studies seem somehow marginalized amidst the larger neighbors, but very pleased about this session indeed. So what I'm going to do is to build, I think, a little bit on what the previous speakers have said. Let me share my screen here. And this effort is, as Eve kindly mentioned, it draws a bit on my current interest, which has moved a bit more towards opposition to autocratization or pushback against backsliding. And I'm going to also dare to make a brief comparison to Thailand, because I think that helps illuminate what I'm trying to say about the lack of pushback or the limited opposition one finds in the Philippine case to the democratic backsliding that's occurred since President Rodrigo Duterte came to office in mid-2016, and of course talk a little bit also about his upcoming departure from office, presumable departure from office next year, the 2022 elections. So as background, Yves said Indonesia was kind of seen as the beacon of democracy in the region. Before that, Philippine people power, if anybody in the audience still remembers that, February 1986, the 35th anniversary of which was not very much celebrated this year in the Philippines or elsewhere, but is worth remembering. It was a kind of a template making event. It was kind of a world media revolution, widely covered. This is, of course, pre-internet days, but still, I think it kind of was the first fully internationally mediatized uprising that one can see, and kind of set the stage for the 1989 revolutions in terms of global interest, and also in a sense was one of the first major third wave, to use Huntington's term, democratization uprisings. Of course, we should also remember the Thai uprising of 1973, which received somewhat less global publicity at the time. But in the 80s in Asia, people power, certainly it was a template for places like Myanmar, China, even 1989, and elsewhere. So it's to be recalled how much of a model the Philippines once seemed to be, and of course how unlikely at the time it seemed the Philippines would be at this period then a new case of autocratization in the region. I've argued previously that the roots of this failure are in the problems of what I've called liberal reformism, which was a commitment to so-called good governance, somewhat similar to the kind of discourse you see in Thailand, that did restore economic growth, but failed to significantly reduce poverty. It was scandal-prone in a patronage-driven political system with weak institutions. It was also characterized, and this is very significant, by sub-national authoritarianism. So while you had a political system nationally with regular elections that were relatively free and fair, with the exception of the 2004 presidential elections, which were controversial and probably manipulated. Nonetheless, you had civil liberties at the national level also observed to some degree. You had political violence, warlordism, extrajudicial killings of so-called legal leftists, in other words, those who are advocating non-violently by the military and by local politicians, warlords. And there was also a kind of alternative, again, there's some parallels to Thailand. The Thaksin Shinawatra of the Philippine cases, Joseph Estrada, who by the way has recently beat off COVID-19 in the recent wave there, which can be called a kind of proletarian populist alternative, that was undermined. Estrada himself was overthrown after a brief presidency. Constitutionally, his friend and fellow movie star politician was cheated in this 2004 election I mentioned. So that's the background to the rise of illiberal populism in the Philippines, which I've termed in an article that's coming out this year in Journal of Contemporary Asia, violent populism. And the point I think that's significant here is that, we see this global wave of populism, yes, but let's not forget that Duterte appears to be the only mass murderer. Yes, other populists have killed off oppositionists, they've engaged in military actions, say in Turkey and the Kurds and so on, but Duterte has instigated mass murder in the name of the war on drugs against civilians, and urban poor male Filipino lives don't seem to matter much in this regard. And there's a lot of controversy about how many people have been killed. I've looked into this pretty carefully, and despite attempts by the police to intentionally obfuscate these figures, I think the figure of about 30,000 murdered is probably closest to what's been going on, rather than the official figure, which is a little bit under 10,000. Duterte nationalized his neo-bossist strategy that he developed in the southern city of Davao, which wooed rather than intimidated voters. So it's a different kind of bossism, which focused on these, this drug-induced evil, targeting also there in Davao, urban poor, drug users and small-time dealers, Once he became president, he's invoked nationalism to respond to human rights criticisms, both domestic and international. He's turned against the left. He initially negotiated with them. He's undertaken very few serious economic reforms and used some anti-oligarchy rhetoric while, of course, and this is not surprising, and very Marcosian, cultivating his own cronies. As a legitimation strategy, even though as an actual way to combat drugs, of course, unsuccessful, as Duterte himself, interestingly, has also admitted recently, it has diverted attention from the death of development in the Philippines, what I've discussed earlier, persistence of high levels of poverty, through the extreme dichotomization of the good people who he's protecting against the criminalized others. And this can help legitimate killings in a weak state with a poor record of human development. Okay, so that's the background, and I think that's, since Marcos, the greatest international interest in the Philippines around the world has been focused on Duterte. So his rise and rule is, I think, widely understood. What I want to focus on now is why has there been so little pushback against this backsliding in the Philippines? Nathan Kippo has recently argued that the regime is still not fully autocratic, and that may seem slightly paradoxical given these killings, but his autocratization has been a creeping form. He's undermined institutions from within. You still have a relatively free civil society and press, despite some important lawsuits, particularly against the major opposition paper Rappler. The opposition did extremely poorly in midterm elections in 2019. They haven't been able to sustain protests, and very importantly, in this age of social media, they've been out-trolled. And despite what one scholar has appropriately, I think, called Duterte's macho populism, which affected his response to the COVID-19 pandemic, denialism like Bolsonaro and Trump's, and then once he switched course, a more or a highly militarized and mismanaged response, which has resulted in a recent sort of Brazil-like new COVID-19 wave. Duterte remains, according to a Philippine observer, probably the world's most popular leader. Now, I say this probably because I haven't gone through all the leaders of the world, but at over 90%, I think he's a likely candidate for the Oscars of popularity, as it were. Quite extraordinary, and the popularity has even risen according to recent opinion polls despite the pandemic, perhaps because of it. I'll talk about that in a second. And the other puzzle here is, of course, Filipinos show in Asian barometer surveys and so on that they support democracy, but there's also, when one digs down deeper into the data, a sense of support for strongman rule. So there's an ambiguity there that Duterte has taken advantage of. So I said I'd mention the Thai case. So let's think about Thailand. Thailand's electoral opposition was quite competitive despite highly manipulated elections and the problematic constitution in 2019. We've seen this gigantic protests of the second half of 2020, a very strong social media presence. Although I think without doubt, at least in terms of institutions, there's been much more democratic backsliding in Thailand than the Philippines. Thailand's repression is in many ways open. There's obvious institutional manipulation. There's little electoral legitimacy. Pao Wen discussed the standing of the monarchy declining. This has catalyzed the formation of an anti-military alliance. This contrasts with the support Duterte has across class and regional lines, which is limited opposition to an urban intelligentsia and so-called red tagged, in other words, pro-communist legal leftists. So Duterte is going after the legal left or letting the military go after them because they're supposedly communists. And many of them have been assassinated recently. There's Bloody Sunday that occurred where about 10 activists were killed on one day alone, leftist activists. So I'm saying it's interesting, this unconstrained executive aggrandizement in the Philippines contrasted with military monarchical rule in Thailand. So looking at the reasons for this, I thought a bit about the Russian case and Vladimir Putin, who also had broad national support through the late 2000s. But you've recently seen the success of Navalny's anti-corruption campaign in mobilizing demonstrations. And this reminded me of the opposition's crony capitalist frame against Marcos, which scholar Carolyn Howe has recently pointed to rightly as the crucial frame in the anti-Marcos struggle. Duterte, by contrast, has been able to keep the focus on a drive for order over law. That's Tom's phrase in an article a couple of years ago, focusing on small-time drug users, lockdown pasawais, these people, these stubborn people who won't obey his laws or rules. He's been blaming them for the problems of the pandemic. They've become the enemies in what I've discussed as his blunt force governance strategy. So given the limitations of the Philippine state, a strong man comes along and says, I can cut through the problems, I can cut through the judicial corruption, I can get the drug dealers and users, I can deal with the pandemic problems because our institutions don't work. I alone with my political will can do so. One prominent journalist, Sheila Cornell, has called him the Vigilante President. I think that also gets close to what I'm talking about here. And this despite numerous drug and even drug-related scandals, really, I mean, including his own, one of his own children, the accusation there, and obvious cronyism, as I mentioned. The opposition, understandably, has been focused on human rights concern, but this has not resonated. This is an interesting issue that Eve also mentioned, where Jokowi, president of Indonesia, Widodo, openly says, I don't care about human rights. Of course, Duterte said that long ago, and many of his citizens seem to agree with that. And finally, I want to talk about the prospects of what's been called Dutertismo after Duterte. As I said, an election's coming up next year. And there's an interesting piece in The Atlantic recently about what happens to populists after they leave power. Berlusconi in Italy, Fujimori in Peru, Perón in Argentina. And the discussion of how their influence is often endured, even though they've left office or been jailed or even have been killed or died. In Southeast Asia, we have to talk about Thaksin, who continues to be a political force and to reckon with in the country, despite having been removed from power and exiled from the country. Political legacies of these leaders are often founded on an aggrieved base populism. We think of Donald Trump's base and how aggrieved it continues to be, as Rebecca said in her opening remarks, and continues to act based on those grievances, voter suppression and so on. Duterte, by contrast, continues to have nationwide support, but this is not rooted in a particular class cleavage, regional cleavage, or other social cleavages. So it's not highly dependent on a highly polarized sense of grievance, because there's very little to be aggrieved about. The country is basically reached consensus. Duterte is a good person and a good ruler, despite these obvious crimes that he's committed, and an urban intelligentsia that is loudly protesting when it can against him, but not effectively at all, as I mentioned. But I'm arguing, given this oversized ruling coalition, to refer back to an old concept of the 1960s, where it's best to have sort of a minimum ruling coalition to be effective, that this is subject to divisions, and given the lack of a strong and clear base, that the prospects of Dutertismo are a bit clouded for the 2022 polls. And there's a very strong likelihood there'll be a lot of splits, and the Philippine electoral system promotes that as a one-off a vote with a lot of different candidates, so a relatively small percentage can bring you into office. And therefore, I'm suggesting this is what's driving the dynastic strategy, why Sara Duterte, pictured here, who, by the way, succeeded Duterte already as mayor of Davao, is seen as a very likely candidate to succeed her father and to continue this style of populist rule. So just to conclude, the challenges to opposition in the Philippines have been very difficult. It's a highly illiberal system, but democratically legitimated, transcends major social cleavages, which has made it difficult to build a broad opposition, and a failure to develop a strong kind of anti-corruption discourse with a focus on human rights. And yet the future of Dutertismo, as I said, is uncertain. And one important point here is, unlike in what Eve was saying about the Indonesian cases, there's really no effort to change the electoral system. So that seems to be set in stone. Even the talk of a revolutionary government by the Duterte administration itself, or by its friends, sort of floated the idea, didn't go down very well. So elections will go forward, it seems, and the prospects of Dutertismo face the kind of challenges I mentioned. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks to Mark for another fantastic presentation. A reminder to keep your questions coming in the Q&A. I'll turn it over for our last presentation of the evening to Ardith Tongmong. Ardith, we can't hear you. You might be muted still.
Sorry, I'm having some technical difficulty here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hold on. Oops.
We can hear you.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for having me here. I'm sure when we talk about authoritarianism in Myanmar, everyone thinks about military sheer repression and brutality, which has taken place since the military staged a coup on February 1st. Up to this date, over 715 protesters have been killed. Over 3,000 people have been arrested, and more than half of people who have been killed were young people. And so it's appeared that all the progresses that have been made in terms of democratic reforms over the past 10 years have been crushed. So it's really difficult not to get emotional, angry, and helpless when we talk about Myanmar nowadays. However, tonight I want to take a little sober approach by focusing on the causes of democratic backsliding and its implications on civil-military relationships and the relationships between majority and minority populations. Specifically, I want to talk about how various forms and degree of authoritarian practices by both the military and the NLD has influenced the nature of alliances that are forming along the pro-military on the one hand and anti-military on the other hand, and how this has allowed the military to exercise divide and rule strategies to try to control the population. So let's talk a little bit about pre-coup situations in Myanmar. The military coup in Myanmar is initially a result of continuing power struggle between the military and the NLD, led by charismatic leader Aung San Suu Kyi, and served as the most powerful opposition movement against the military in 1988 and 2015. The NLD leaders were either in exile or under house arrest until 2010, when the military held elections and a new constitution. And this new constitution transformed Myanmar from military dictatorship to a semi-democratic government that acknowledged military role in safeguarding the constitution, giving military significant control over security issue, and over passing of major legislation by controlling 25% of all legislative seats. The military proxy party, which is known as USDP, won the 2010 elections and implemented some major democratic reforms over the next 5 years, and which includes the release of political prisoners such as Aung San Suu Kyi. The NLD later won a landslide victory in 2015, and there was a smooth transfer of power from the USDP government. However, tensions arose between the NLD and military during the NLD government in 2015-2020 period, as Aung San Suu Kyi was able to implement a variety of measures that seriously undermine the Tamador, or the military's, confidence in its ability to contain the new administrations. These actions include Aung San Suu Kyi's being able to successfully circumvent constitutional restrictions that prevent her from becoming president by assuming the role of the state councillor, which is similar to a prime minister position in semi-presidential system, and her assuming the position of foreign minister, which is another important and powerful position. She has also tried but failed to change the constitution to reduce the number of seats reserved for the military in the parliament. And so under the NLD government, the military also lost its monopolies over the economy, its power to regulate foreign trade and access to foreign currency reserves, and saw its shares of the national budget reduced. The NLD government has also had a rocky relationship with ethnic minorities, which constitute about 30% of the country, dominated by Burma populations. Compared to the previous administration, the NLD appear less subject to minority pressure because it has enjoyed higher levels of legitimacy and popular support among the Burma majority. And therefore, ethnic political parties, armed groups, and civil society groups began to feel alienated by what they saw as the NLD's high-handed and exclusive policies. And examples include NLD refusal to appoint members of elected ethnic parties into its cabinet or as chief ministers in their respective states, and naming a bridge in Mon State after Aung San Suu Kyi's father, General Aung San, who is considered the country's national independence hero, and thereby overriding the local wishes to adopt a name more in line with the Mon regional identity. The NLD government also erected a statue of Aung San in Kayah State against the wishes of Kayah people, and it prohibited Karen minority groups from referring to Baoji as a martyr at a public ceremony. And Baoji is hailed as a Karen revolutionary hero among Karen, and he was killed by the Myanmar army in early independence era. Ethnic political parties also complained that the proposed final constitutional amendments submitted by the NLD-dominated parliament focused more on reducing the role of military and enhancing Aung San Suu Kyi's power than on devolving power to ethnic states. And at the same time, the NLD decision-making power was very centralized and top-down and concentrated mainly at the hands of the executive committee, and specifically at the hands of Aung San Suu Kyi. And there was very little tolerance for internal dissent. Some outspoken members left the NLD to run as independents or to form new parties. Members of international community were also disappointed when Aung San Suu Kyi failed to advocate for the plight of estimated 1 million Rohingya Muslims in northern Rakhine State, most of whom fled to Bangladesh over the late 2017 following Myanmar's brutal campaign against Rohingya militant group. The Rohingya crisis, meanwhile, significantly increased support for Suu Kyi in Myanmar, especially after she appeared at the International Court of Justice at The Hague in December 2019 to deny accusations that the Myanmar army was responsible for genocide. Let me talk a little bit about the elections. Despite its declining popularity in ethnic areas, the NLD managed to win an overwhelming election victory in 2020. And after complaints by about 20 political parties which lost the elections, the Damodar demanded an investigation into the possibility of election fraud by Myanmar Elections Commission, which is made up of NLD appointee. However, the NLD and the commission dismissed these allegations, although such errors are understandable in a country that does not have accurate and reliable population data, and where COVID-related challenges have further hampered EC's, Union Elections Commission's ability to provide adequate training for volunteers. The election was accompanied by complaints about voters' registrations error, localized outbreaks of violence, and cancellations of voting in ethnic minorities areas by election authorities, and widespread disenfranchisement both among the country's stateless Rohingya minority, as well as additional 1.5 million people. However, independent observers have expressed that these shortcomings do not substantially affect election results. The Damodar therefore claimed that its takeover was an act of last resort following its failure to get an adequate response from the elections authorities and the NLD. It then arrested most of the top NLD leaders and placed the country under emergency period with its announced plan to hold another elections to bring the country back to quote unquote disciplined democracy. But as we all know, after that, everything has gone south. So I want to talk about the alliances that have recently emerged in response to the coup. The coup has generally divided the populations into three camps: pro-coup, anti-coup, and those sitting in the middle. Individuals and political parties that supported the coup are small political parties that either have complained about elections fraud or those that did not have good relationship with the NLD, such as the Arakan National Party or the Mon Unity Party. And Dr. Duterte, who is a former NLD member and now Social Welfare Minister of the military junta. There are currently 20 major armed groups that have fought for greater autonomy and independence, greater autonomy since Myanmar gained independence in 1948. But most ethnic armed groups have denounced the military, but to large extent, they restrain themselves from launching military offensive against the military. And this, in a way, has saved the military by not having to launch wars on all fronts. The exceptions are two largest armed groups, two of the largest armed groups, the KIA in the China border and KNU in Thailand, have not only denounced the coup, but also hosted activists and defectors. They launched offensive war against the military. And as a consequence, the Duterte has intensified war against those groups, including the use of airstrike against unarmed civilians, which have caused considerable destruction, death, and displacement of more than 25,000 Korean residents. The military side is also strengthened by the support of China, Russia, which has been able to block any actions that are against the military at the UN Security Council. ASEAN members as a whole has stuck to the principle of non-interference and peaceful resolutions to the between the two sides. Anti-coup alliance is, however, made up of the majority people, including those who do not like the NLD, and it has cut across all walks of life, ages, and across different generations, even though the movement has been mainly led by younger generations known as Gen Z. They have received moral and financial support from international communities and Myanmar diaspora. They have wanted to see some sort of military intervention from the US or the UN, but this has not taken place yet. In the meantime, because the military initially targeted senior members of the NLD, many NLD members have either been arrested or fled, and thereby failing to provide effective leadership for the anti-coup movement. However, exiled NLD lawmakers have managed to form the committee representing the parliament, known as CRPH, to function as a parallel governing body and to provide general guidelines and instructions to protesters. But these 17 members of CRPH is predominantly NLD and can no longer monopolize the agenda of a larger anti-coup coalition, which is now led by diverse groups of people and organizations, including minority ethnic organizations. In addition, military repression has also reduced existing prejudice against ethnic minorities, including Rohingyas, and resulted in the expressions of sympathies to the aspirations of the minority groups and support for ethnic armed groups. So as a consequence, the CRPH has reluctantly adopted a federal democracy model as an alternative to the 2008 constitution, which they eliminated on April 1st, and implemented federal charter with a plan to form a federal army with a broad ethnic base. And this, I would say, a dramatic turnaround from a party that has completely opposed that has opposed the concept and implementation of federal democracy. The truth, however, is that ethnic minorities have fought fiercely against Burma majority as much as they fought among themselves. However, protesters have participated in a broad coalition in the belief that getting rid of military dictatorship is the most urgent issue, with other political differences to be resolved in the future. However, there's no doubt that Myanmar is now at a critical crossroad, witnessing for the first time in its history the elevations of minority aspirations to the center of the country's national political agenda. So I would like to conclude with some updates. The military has now regained some forms of control in some core areas by using brute force and by trying to cut all sorts of supports for protest movement, while continuing to intensify its repression in several peripheral areas. However, protests has continued in small scale and in different forms. Some activists have fled to the border areas to receive armed training with the intention to engage in urban guerrilla warfare. And in many areas, you see that some protesters form civil defense forces, beginning to use weapons and explosives against the military. Some experts now speculated that the country will shrink, the economy will shrink by 10 to 20%, either because of political instability, civil disobedient movement initiated by protesters, and military's own actions, as well as international sanctions. It's difficult to predict how the situations will unfold, but continuing power struggle between the military, which has everything to lose, and anti-coup movement, which has nothing to lose, will prolong and intensify the crisis, the current crisis, with huge humanitarian disaster impact that we have never seen before in the country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ardeth, and thanks to all the panelists for their remarkable comments. We covered a ton of territory, and in the past hour or so, you've had tremendous insights to share with all of us about the state of democracy and authoritarianism across the region. So we've got formally 15 more minutes left in the program, and a bunch of questions that are showing up in the Q&A function. What I'm going to do is take one at a time. I'm going to be focusing on questions that are directed, I think, to all of the panelists. And the first question that I'll take for all the panelists is from Rick Donor. Rick has two questions. They're open to any of you all. One is, what has been the role of indigenous business and labor in the process of growing authoritarianism? I presume foreign firms have been largely passive and accommodating. And related to this is a question of how the panelists think about the impact of inequality, income inequality, and stagnation of social mobility in general in creating the conditions for authoritarianism. So I'll open it up to any of the panelists who'd like to respond. And please, to get as many questions as we can, let's try to keep our comments to about a minute.
Okay, I can comment on that, but sorry, Mark, you go first. You go.
Okay, just very quickly. Thanks for that, Rick. I would just say, this is my depth of development argument, that the Philippines has had growth, macroeconomic growth, but according to opinion polls that do so-called self-measured poverty, it's still about 50% in the country, and since the pandemic, it's probably more like 3/4. So absolutely essential. Business is a bit divided, cowed by Duterte, but and labor has been disappointed by him because he didn't deliver his promises when he was leaning more left during his campaign.
So Indonesia is also one of these countries where there's kind of had this structurally, poverty has actually been decreasing for a long time, but there are huge numbers of economically precarious Indonesians. And I think that what that does is it sort of reinforces clientelistic relationships between voters and politicians. So vote buying is really sort of ubiquitous in Indonesian elections at the local level, especially. And what we've seen over the years is that as politics has become so expensive, the kinds of people moving into politics in Indonesia at the local level and obviously the national level too, are coming from a much more narrow sort of, they're a more narrow type of people. So business indigenous people, wealthy people. They're the ones that are kind of getting into legislative bodies at the provinces, districts, national level. And so business is kind of infusing politics in a way that's sort of becoming more intense, I think. And that has, really clear consequences for Indonesia's democracy. First of all, it becomes less representative if you have less people from different sorts of backgrounds, less activists, scholars, bureaucrats coming into political positions of power. But more specifically, and I think this speaks to the question of the role of the indigenous business elite in these processes, and I'm writing an article about this, so I'm excited to answer the question, is that we can see actual moments, specific moments of democratic decline in the last few years in Indonesia have involved indigenous business elite. So whether it's the regression in terms of the changes to the Corruption Eradication Commission, the omnibus law, the way in which the omnibus law that I described earlier, which had serious implications for labor and environment, those laws were rushed through with the backing of, parts of larger business, big business associations, that were kind of, the big business, not the sort of medium-sized indigenous businesses. And Jokowi has really kind of intensified his relationship with the business community. And as a result, we've seen those sorts of laws that, and in many ways, the story of Indonesia's the resources boom as well is really important because it's not just any kind of business people that are kind of getting into politics. It's people who have a lot of mining concessions, plantations, and things like this. And we can see that the fruits of that kind of process in the sorts of illiberal and undemocratic laws that have been passed in recent years. I'll leave it there.
Ardith Powen, any comment on this question?
No, I don't, because I'm doing I'm answering the question from on Thailand by typing at the moment. But I would join you in other questions. So
Ardith, anything from you?
I was not paying attention. I was looking at my question. Sorry about that.
That's fine. Well, there's also the next question I'd like to take is from Alejandra Molina. She asks a very provocative question. Can the panelists comment on the father-daughter macho populism, women carrying the political torch phenomenon, which we can find in the case of Duterte? We can also find this in the case of Fujimori in Peru. And then all of us Southeast Asia experts, we can all find our own example in the other countries listed here as well. So I wonder if any of the panelists would like to comment on this.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to jump in again, but we have an obvious example in the Philippines with Sara Duterte. And we had another example with the former President Arroyo, who was the daughter of a president in the 1960s. So it's been quite a common phenomenon. I mean, it's dynastic politics with a twist, right? And the interesting thing perhaps is, it sometimes works, this generalization. So in the case of the Duterte, Sarah, despite everything, she did punch a sheriff in the nose in front of rolling cameras. So she's not a softie, but somehow compared to her father, she seems a bit more low key. And so you get the softer sort of version of the Duterte dynasty. Arroyo presented herself that way as well, but then ultimately was seen as a highly corrupt president. But it's an interesting twist in dynastic politics, and it's part of this larger phenomenon of female dynastic leaders. Think of Aung San Suu Kyi and her legacy from her father, and Megawati Sukarno-Putri, of course, in Indonesia.
Well, I'd like to add when we talk about dynastic politics, of course, in Thailand, we have the case of the Shinawatra family. So, I mean, you seem not to be able to run away from Shinawatra no matter what. I had a privilege to interview Thaksin, in a couple of times. And then he kept saying that, we run out of member in the family to run, for the office. I said that maybe you might have to forget about your family now and just seriously move forward with other better alternatives. But you also have to admit that the Shinawatra had done something quite, I wouldn't say good, but quite influential, for Thailand, and it sort of generated a lasting impact, in terms of basically uplifting the livelihood of the people. This is something that Thai people would never be able to experience under the old regime. And I must say that both Thaksin and Yingluck have been able to do so. But I guess that the emergence of new kind of politician in the form of Future Forward Party, which I did not have a chance to talk about, by Thanathorn. I mean, this is something that is very interesting. I don't know whether we could say that we might start to see Thailand moving away from the dynastic domination of Thaksin and Yingluck towards something rather fresh and new under Thanathorn. And I think what Thanathorn has given to Thai society, something that is very important, is ideology politics, something that you couldn't find in Thaksin, because I think Thanathorn, not only breaking free from dynastic domination of politics, but he also proposed sort of progressive agenda, such as withdrawal of the military from politics, and then using Indonesia as a kind of example, and also even go to the extent of reform of the monarchy.
The next question I'd like to address to the panelists is from Roger Huang, and it asks about how we ought to think about the relationship between current developments in politics across the region and the obvious other thing that's happening, the COVID-19 pandemic. I'd like to maybe start with Ardith to see if she can share any thoughts from the Burmese perspective.
Yes. To me, COVID-19 case in Myanmar is a mysterious case. Myanmar, the infection case was very low compared to other countries before the coup. I think it's partly because the state does not have enough capacity to do the testing. But after the coup, no one talked about COVID. And so I was very concerned about that. So I talked to doctors and medical professions who are working on the ground and asked them if they have seen any COVID cases, but they said that they have not seen any COVID cases. So that was no one talks about it, and no mention of patients being treated with COVID symptoms. So it just disappeared, and they were not able to, the government the military was not able to do more testing.
That seems like a tremendously interesting observation. I'm sure that the coup did not stop COVID. It just perhaps suppressed the ability to discuss it.
Yes. Well, some people joke that COVID was scared of the coup, so COVID fled.
That's amazing. Any of our other panelists want to comment on this?
Well, COVID has become so politicized in Thailand. I think very similar to Myanmar. We have low cases at the beginning of those affected by COVID. But it doesn't mean that the government handled the situation effectively. Because as time goes by, it is more evident that this government has been incapable of dealing with COVID situation. By now, we only have such low number of those have had a vaccination. It becomes so much politicized because, again, the Future Forward Party sort of exposed a kind of a rumor that the monarchy would want to invest in a kind of vaccination so that it would give the return in terms of financial reward back to the monarchy. So I know that the issue has become so complex, but once again, it has become so much politicized, especially with the interference into the administration on the part of the monarchy. And because of that, Thanathorn, the leader of Future Forward Party, might be charged with lèse majesté for accusing the monarchy of intervening in the COVID situation.
Yeah.
Tom, sorry, Dave.
So, as I say, I think in the Indonesian case, COVID really has presented a kind of opportunity for elites with sort of anti-democratic designs. Under the cover of COVID, some of those laws that I was discussing were able to be rushed through very quickly and they've kind of and they knew that sort of, civil society organizations They found it much harder to mobilize, much harder to meet, obviously. It was also a way of legitimizing the government's really sort of heavy-handed response to protest. And the Jokowi government also introduced, and the police, new regulations that banned sort of people from criticizing the government when it comes to COVID-19, all kind of framed again in this discourse of sort of needing discipline and needing order at a time of crisis like this. So I think that, for most of us, we sort of see COVID as a kind of, it's helped to accelerate the processes of democratic decline that were already underway prior to the pandemic.
Just to add the Philippine example, there was that worry in the Philippines as well that Duterte would use COVID to increase his authoritarian powers, and the lockdown, of course, has done that to an extent. But again, the surprise is, at least for those who hadn't been watching closely enough, is that it even made Duterte more popular. And it's this disconnect between efficacy and popularity. Now the Philippines has a kind of Brazil-like wave. It's really quite bad, and it's rapidly becoming the worst case in Southeast Asia. And so, but the Teflon presidency remains, and this kind of brute force government. I can do it. You'll go on TV every night, kind of a rambling presentation late at night, but it gives the people the sense that I'm on your side, and I'm being tough and dealing with this crisis as I did with the drug war.
These are fascinating discussions. I'm mindful of time, so I want to take two final questions, and these are relevant for all four panelists. So I'd like to welcome your comments. The first of these is from Cornell's own Magnus Fiskefjord, who was asked about if the panelists can comment on the role of China and links between the Southeast Asian countries in question and China, in particular the Chinese brand of authoritarianism in sort of shaping politics or narratives about how politics should unfold in the region. And then the other question is from Bridget Nandal, who was asked a question which is quite penetrating and relevant for this audience, which is, how is it that we should study this phenomenon? All of us are involved in various ways in studying politics in countries that are not as liberal in their laws and their politics as they once were. How do we study the phenomenon of contemporary authoritarianism in the region without putting any of our research subjects or ourselves, I should add, in harm's way? So we'll start with the question on China. Anybody want to jump in on this one?
Sure. Okay, let me start first. This is very intriguing, especially I would say this in the context of Thai-US and China relations. That would be more logical. Thailand has been military allies of the United States, and but recently, I don't think the US has paid enough attention in the political development in Thailand, and because of the domestic crisis within the United States in itself. I mean, I myself would never think that Southeast Asia, including Thailand, would rank high in US foreign policy. And because of that, there seemed to be sort of detachment between US and Thailand recently amid the political crisis in my own country. You could see that after the coup, the US paid again little attention, only imposing soft sanctions against the Thai coup by suspending only $4.6 million. That is nothing, Within this situation, China sort of emerged and then served as a kind of political legitimacy provider for the Thai regime. And because of that, you started to see the connection between Thailand and China so strongly. You could say that this day the Thai regime look up to China and also try to learn from sort of best authoritarian practices, right? You have to use that term, and there's nothing that US could do because pushing Thailand too hard on the basis of democracy promotion, they would only drive Thailand into the Chinese orbit. Not talking about democracy in Thailand at all, the US would be condemned, at the international level. So you started to see US sort of being ambivalent, cannot do much more than that. And because of that, I think it gives a lot of benefit for the Thai regime to start to play the two power against each other.
I can make some comments on Indonesia. So Indonesia has a really sort of strong economic imperative that drives it to kind of maintain close relations with China, at least in the economic sphere. You know, like the country I'm from, Australia, you know, Indonesia benefited hugely from the boom in China and as a kind of commodity exporting country. And not just that, but Indonesia's business elite and many of the political business elites, Indonesia, who are kind of high up in the state, have personal business connections and investments with China. So, and I think that will prevent Indonesia from making the kind of ideological or presenting some sort of ideological kind of stance against China in the region that we see Australia doing right now with serious economic consequences. But beyond that, you know, despite Indonesia having this really long history of kind of anti-communism, you know, following the anti-communist massacres of the 60s, communism remains illegal in Indonesia. At the same time, and being called a communist is, you know, sort of, you know, it's politically very dangerous. But at the same time, the administration, as I said, has these close economic ties, and Jokowi himself has said in various ways that, you know, he looks to the China development model, China's development, its strong state, and that the order that it's able to create in order to enhance development. He looks at that as a model, and he looks at Vietnam as well for the same sort of reason. It's hard to sort of say, you know, kind of in empirical terms what influence China has on Indonesia's democratic decline, but I would just make those comments about the kind of the closeness of the two economically and in terms of as a development model, if not a political model.
So China has a very complicated relationship with different members of different parts of the society groups and government and military. So I don't think China is necessarily pro-military. China's main focus in the country is economic. To protect its economic interests, because China has a lot of economic states in the country, and to have political stability. So and then China is also very much aware that there has been a lot of growing anti-Chinese sentiment against the government. And before the coup, China tried very hard to cultivate relationship with, you know, different, not just the NLD, but also the military, as well as political parties. And China is alleged to have provided some military and, you know, logistic support to armed groups that are operating in the China-Burma border area. So they have a very complicated and diverse relation with different groups of people in the country, but their main interest is to protect their economic interests and to maintain a political stability in a way that will protect their economic interests. So to the point that they will be eventually siding with the force that are able to maintain and control the country, to bring back the stability. And I think that they're trying to keep this balance. So the fact that they're not really, you know, they're blocking any actions against the military in the Security Council show that they are more likely to side with the military, and that in a way has strengthened the military control as well as military dictatorship in the country. Yeah.
I'll give last comments to Mark.
Yeah, just briefly, you know, Duterte's pivot to China, I think, is relatively well known. Interesting, of course, why that is. He has this kind of visceral distrust of the U.S. that's based on some personal experience, apparently, but also this kind of anti-colonial discourse that he shares with his generation. Actually, one of his professors is the titular head of the Communist Party of the Philippines. Kind of an interesting story, his kind of leftist roots. But also the genuine sense that China stands for development, and, you know, the kind of infrastructure projects he was interested in, kind of the hard hand kind of view. And of course, also with Western criticism of the drug war and the killings, a kind of illiberal realignment that's helped by closer ties to China and threats to cut off the visiting forces agreement with the US, for example, when his police chief didn't get a visa. Personal pique played a role. But of course, China's role in the South China Sea, this recent militia incident, the Whitsun Reef, previous incidents, Philippines calls it West Philippine Sea, of course. The opposition is pressing hard. Duterte himself has been silent, but his defense minister, his foreign minister have spoken out. And so that is, that's pushing Philippines a bit back toward the US camp. But the final point I think is worth mentioning, the China model as a governance model has very little attraction in the Philippines, in part because, you know, the point about the Duterte regime is it effectively sells itself as democratic, which may seem a bit odd given these killings. But, you know, he wins elections, he won the midterms, he has high popularity, there's going to be elections next year. So it's not an authoritarian system, according to I think the views of most Filipinos.
There's lots more questions in the queue, and there's lots of energy among the participants and our panelists, but I'm sorry to say that I think that we'll have to draw the event to a close today. We've already gone over 8 minutes, and I apologize to you all for that. But I have a couple thank yous before we close. I want to first thank our panelists for their insightful and really interesting comments and thoughts on the state of democracy in Southeast Asia. I learned personally a lot about countries that even those that I know pretty well. And so I think this has been a real opportunity for all of us. So I want to give you our thanks. I'd also like to thank Rebecca Slayton, my co-host, for helping to put this together. And some special thanks to the Southeast Asia program and to the Reppy Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies here at Cornell for all the logistical support, the perfectly flawless Zoom execution, and for supporting everything here. This has been a fantastic event. I suspect we may want to do one of these again in a couple of months. I think that we'll probably have more to talk about and times keep changing. So watch this space for more. That's it for us today. Thanks to everybody. I really appreciate all of your participation and all of your excellent questions. Thank you.